Hey pole dancer, welcome to the Evidence-Based Pole Podcast. My name is Rosie Boa. I'm a pole dancer, pole teacher, and personal trainer, and I've started this podcast so that we can learn together, talk with the experts, read the research, and feel better on and off the pole. So if that sounds like something you're interested in doing, let's go. Welcome. Today I am joined by Kelsey Britt, a somatic sexuality educator, and I know that that's not like exactly the precise type of knowledge and stuff that we've been discussing recently, although, we had that episode with Dr. Tia, the pelvic floor therapist recently, which, we did talk about sex and that. But I think part of the reason why it's important for folks in the pole space in particular to think about sex and sexuality is because pole is sexy. It is inexorably linked with the sensual in our cultural milieu, certainly here in the United States. And it's something that affects us in our dance. So even though, Kelsey is not a pole instructor, she still works in the space. So start off with, Kelsey, do you want to talk a little bit about your movement history, how you came to be perhaps a sexuality educator, and then also what is a somatic sexuality educator? Those are three words that come together. What do they mean?
Yeah, great questions. So my experience coming into the sexuality education world is kind of a long process, but growing up, I grew up in a very conservative part of the US in Indiana and received abstinence only. Definitely it was something that I was interested in and that I was experiencing. And so when I got into college, I started finally taking classes around sexuality, and I got involved in research projects and the sexual assault advocacy group that was on our campus. And afterwards, I taught sex ed for a couple of years in middle schools and high schools. And so that was very much into the realm of like birth control, STIs, healthy relationships, consent, all that stuff. And that work was really important and impactful for me. But I think what I realized since then is that we are missing the body from a lot of sex, which is a huge. And so for me, that's kind of how I started feeling more interested in bringing the body into my work and to bringing that to other folks. And I had a very, personal experience with that as well in terms of getting into it, where about 3 years ago, I started doing yoga a little bit more in my personal life. I'd been dabbling in it for the past decade, but 3 years ago, I started practicing more, and it brought me a lot of feelings of safety and resilience that I had recovering from sexual assault. Like that was really important to be finally feeling safe in my body, to be able to make choices about my body. And that was because I was taking the classes online. I was able to choose the instructors. I was able to choose like what type of flow I was doing, and I could opt out of it at any time, which really important. And I also didn't feel that pressure to be doing the forms in a certain way, to be super flexible, which is something that had kind of steered me away from yoga in the past. And then I also started noticing that it was making me feel more present in my body in a way that I had never felt before. Like I was like mid-pandemic and I was walking across the carpet in my house, and I just like felt the sensation of the carpet on my feet in a way that I had never felt before. And over time, I started realizing that being able to be present in my body was making an impact on my sex life in terms of like being able to really, and when distracting thoughts started to come up, I could kind of, the cool thing about it is when I started recognizing those things in my own life, then I started kind of wondering whether that's something that other people had experienced too. And turns out it is. There's a lot of research backing the impact of trauma-informed yoga on survivors of trauma, including sexual assault. And also there's really exciting research that's happening around the impact of mindfulness programs, including something like mindful movement like yoga on people's desire.
And I think a lot of things you mentioned there are probably going to resonate with pole students as well, or in particular, feeling like you're not going to be good enough, flexible, strong enough to feel like you belong. And also, obviously you mentioned sort of like being disembodied as a result of trauma, but even if you've never experienced trauma, and I hope that for everybody, there are a lot of other factors that may lead you to have less of a connection to your body, right? So I know neurodivergence, a lot of different types of, ways of being in a brain will result in less coherent connection with your body. I believe there's also been some research on hypermobility and EDS that results in less connection to the body, people who suffer from chronic pain. So there's all sorts of reasons why you may not feel, this tight connection and presence in your body in addition to trauma, although of course trauma is one that affects a lot of folks.
For sure. And there's even a lot of research that shows that women are just more unaware of their bodies. It is something that really...
And so you mentioned, mindful movement, paying attention to your body. And folks may not be familiar with this term somatic. Do you want to talk about it a little bit? Well, I should say, perhaps if you're a D&D player, you're familiar with it from D&D. I don't think that really gets to the meat of the nut.
Yeah, so somatic is just, a simple term is just involving the body and within that realm.
I don't think everyone who works in somatic spaces necessarily adheres to this belief, but I know there has been some theoretical work on the idea of the soma, which is not our physical body, but our, mental understanding of our physical body. So if you're familiar with like perceptual homunculi, I assume most people won't be, but if you are with them, there's a relationship there as well. But again, I think that that's more like on the theoretical side, and not everyone who works in a somatic fashion is necessarily gonna have strong opinions or beliefs about that. So we talked about, somatic, we talked about sexuality education, and obviously you're also a yoga teacher. I don't know what that is. Do you want to talk a little bit about what doing yoga with, or any sort of movement, right? Let's, tie it to pole, with the intent of bringing in sexuality means? How does it look different from other movement, or does it look different from other movement?
Yeah, for sure. So I would say that my background with movement is primarily in dance. I used to just take a lot of different dance classes, including pole. And it was something that I really loved doing, but I think that in dance for me, something that kind of kept me from being in my body is I was always thinking about the way that I look while I was doing it. So I would think about like, how does this shape look? Am I doing it right? Am I like matching the music? But I was just so focused on like how, not how my body felt. I was very out of my body. And I think for me, yoga was initially like that because taking classes, like I said, I would compare myself to people in terms of flexibility because I'm not super flexible. I'm not like the super thin yoga person. And so I don't know, that was also really taking me out. And that's not how yoga is really supposed to be. Yoga, with its ancient roots and like South Asian cultures, is really about the liberation of suffering. And it's not about comparing yourself to other people or becoming the most flexible person. But that's the way that white supremacy has, crafted it in the US and other Western cultures. And so I think for me over the past couple of years with yoga, but also something that I'm really trying to do with dance too, when I'm dancing on my own, is to really just be very present in my body and, think about how each movement feels, not how it necessarily looks. Although I think that can be, especially if you're performing or when you are doing these moves, or if you are in a yoga form, like how does that specifically feel in the places on your body that are being stretched, the places in your body that you're moving? For pole, like how is it feeling when you're, hanging upside down and you're gripping on the pole? And that's not always the best sensation, but I think there's something that's really worthwhile in being present and what they're telling you.
Yeah, absolutely. To tie it back to sort of sexuality education, the idea that we view movement, particularly in like a commercialized Western setting, through the external experience of that movement rather than the internal experience of that movement. It really reminds me of, I can't remember the exact quote or who it's by, you may, but basically it was a feminist scholar who's like, women, and this is, very binary thinking, but women have a man in their head who watches them, right? Like there's this like internalized male gaze and a performative aspect to even things like walking around in the world, eating, right? So that all actions are viewed through this external experience rather than the internal experience, right? Or I'm going to talk about food for a bit. So I'll give a thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube when I'm done talking about food. But even the idea that when we eat food, the important thing is how it changes our body for the expectations of others rather than our physical experience of eating, and the fact that we need it to stay alive that's messed up. That's really messed up. Also,
yeah,
you're good. We're done with that.
Yeah, it's so messed up. And it identify and think about because it's so much a part of our lives. Like with the example that you just gave, like it's something that we do every day. But, we're thinking, if you go on a date, like how many of us monitor what we eat for the other person and choose to eat something that's not messy or something that is perceived as being healthier? Or in our sex lives, we think about like, when you're having sex with someone, a lot of people will start doing what's called spectatoring. So they'll start viewing themselves rather than, being really like into whatever sensations are happening. And it's devastating to me that this is something that kind of like haunting us and almost like everything that's going on in our lives. And it's so difficult to overcome because it's how women are socialized. And it's something that's like ingrained from the time that you're a little girl, learning what to wear and what is appropriate to wear and how to act around people when we're adults.
And I think it also, is very closely linked to trans misogyny as well, right? Like my experience of your experience of womanhood is less important than your actual embodied experience of womanhood. And yeah, I often think about, we're sort of going down a rabbit hole here, but I often think about the fact that women are often sort of treated like consumer goods. Obviously it happens, to other folks as well, but, particularly in a patriarchal society, there is a lot around that, right? And that's, including all women and, femmes and people who are perhaps against their will gendered as women and being treated as like, you have to be in a specific way so that you are pleasant to be consumed and that's your job. And I think that in the pole space in particular, again, thinking about women, femmes, people who may be gendered as female, even against their will, that's something that we really struggle with, right? Like I made a post a while ago that was like, hey, you can be weird. It's okay. You don't have to look pretty. It is fine. Do the weird shit. And someone on the post was like, yeah, but you got to remember to point your toes. And I was like, you absolutely do not. Absolutely you do not. That is not a requirement, right? This is an expectation that someone else has placed on you for their external experience of your movement. And sometimes I point my toes because it feels good, right? Especially if I'm stretching or if I'm pivoting on the ball of my foot. I don't want my heel down because that stresses the ligaments of the knee in particular. But lots of times I'm just doing it because I've been told to do it and not because I actually enjoy doing it. And I think that pulls in, pole and other movements like yoga and, obviously sexuality as well.
Yeah, I have like so many thoughts going on. But thinking about women as like being socialized into being like consumer goods, like I think about the clothes that we have to wear or that we're encouraged to wear, like heels, which can be like extremely some folks, the tight clothing that's very revealing, and the way that like you're kind of tuned out to like, how does this feel in my body, and tuned into like, will someone find this pleasing? And even this idea that like you find it pleasing because someone else will find it pleasing. But when we start tuning into that, our own wants, our own desires, which we first recognize in our body and our body's emotions and feelings, we can start living a life that is more authentic and is where we're getting more of our needs met. When I think about something like pole, I think, yeah, some people do love doing those specific movements, like your toes or, like creating that perfect shape, but like that might not feel good in your body. So is there a way that you can tune into that and to think about like, does this feel good in my body? Is this something I really want to be doing? Or is this something that I've seen on Instagram that looks like it feels good in someone else's body, or something that I feel like I want to do because I'll be interesting or cool or, liked if I am doing this?
Yeah. I think that's I think it's a question that a lot of people may not have asked themselves before. I don't know. Perhaps if you've been my student for a while and I've talked at you about different things, you might be like, yeah, I think about what I want all the time. But could you give us some pointers for, and this is going to sound weird, but figuring out what you want? Because we've talked about sort of like this layer of like outside experience and expectations and pressures and social pressures, and even just like in a dance class, maybe like, oh, I have to do it, a certain way. In a yoga class, I have to like go to the absolute extreme of my range of motion, even if it doesn't feel good to be there. So how can you start to unpick that? How can you start to figure out what you really want?
I think that is such a tough question for a lot of people and can take a lot of time to answer. And I think that it really comes down to giving yourself that permission to explore your body and to have curiosity about your body. And I really recommend to folks that they find spaces that support that exploration and curiosity, which is what I really love about like trauma-informed yoga and incorporating trauma-informed practices into all movement classes, because I think it's, even for folks who don't have like big T trauma, I think we've all experienced places in our life where we've had our choices limited or we've been told to repress things in our body. And so going into spaces where that teacher is telling you like you have choices, you have options, and like I'm really welcoming and celebrating that exploration, I think is so important, because I know that when you go into spaces and the person in charge is not providing those opportunities, it's really difficult to go against that, especially if you're in the beginning. Doing this for a while now, and I still have difficulty if I go into a yoga class or a dance class that is very much like, you need to do this in this way, this time, this is how it's supposed to look. And so I think, I just encourage people to seek out those spaces and give yourself that permission to explore and to like feel it out. And if you discover it's, that's not something you like, that's information for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking especially in like the concept of freestyle and free dance, a little peel back the curtain for how I structure my free dance classes, as there's a nice long warm up and then we have 2 exercises. And in the first exercise, I will ask you to do something that generally isn't going to feel as good, right? So an example is recently we were really thinking about our hips, and I was like, all right, for this movement, this dance, I want you to try not to move your hips, which especially in pole, very challenging.
Yeah.
And then like contrasting that with the next exercise, I was like, move your hips as much as you want, to find that, that tension and that contrast there, to figure out which feels good. Because I mean, particularly if you have like a lot of ballet background, maybe you've had a lot of training in having like a very upright, stable carriage, and not moving your hips is like, yeah, this is what I like. I don't like, sticking my booty out. That's just not for me, which is perfectly fine, right? But you won't know until you explore, and you really explore in a way that feels safe and comfortable for you. So, and that's like within the realm of free dance. I'm not immediately like, move your hips. All right, you have to grind 3, 4, 5 and hump, right? Like that's not the vibe. It's like explore in a way that feels good to you. And I'm sure, very similar in your yoga classes, where you give options and you let people try stuff and figure out what they like. Yeah, and the dance you don't like is the dance that teaches you what you don't like, which is good and important.
Yeah. It is really important. And just to give yourself that space to kind of, like feel out through like the discomfort that might arise. Because I think that's the space that's really tricky, because sometimes we do have these automatic like yeses. Like that feels so good. I really want to do that. And sometimes we have very automatic, clear no of like, I definitely don't want to do this. Like it's not right for me. But I think there's a lot of space in the middle that it's, not really clear like which way we want to go. Yeah. So giving yourself that space to like, maybe you explore or maybe you stop for the day, and not feeling shame about that, because I think sometimes we don't feel good in because like everyone else in the class is doing it, or maybe because the teacher has created that environment where they're making it difficult to opt out. But really giving yourself that permission to just say no.
Absolutely. You're an adult. Well, certainly if you're working with me, I don't work with kids. You're an adult. You can always, hit the bricks. You just get out of there. You can leave at any time from any situation, and movement classes are no exception.
Yeah. And that's what I think is really, for me, why I chose to really start teaching about sexuality with movement, is because I think it's a safer place to explore things that can be translated into the sexual realm. Because when you're with a partner, it's really sometimes challenging to figure out what you're wanting and whether you want to keep going or if there's something you want to do. And I think it can be challenging to share that with a partner too, because of sex negativity, because of fear of how they might react, because of past traumatic experiences. But practicing these skills about like being able to really witness your sensations and also being able to take action on those sensations is something that I think is more low stakes in the movement class realm. Like if someone's taking a class with you and they decide they do not want to point their toes that day, or they don't want to do a certain movement, that's something that you're learning in the body in that moment, that like it's okay to say no, it's okay to choose not to do something, and it's a place where your body is maybe rewriting scripts that it's been given in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, particularly if you're in an in-person class, I teach online. I have students who just don't turn on their cameras, and I am fine with that. And I think that can help remove that pressure that, again, when you're with a partner, presumably you'd like them to have a good time. And sometimes I think that pressure can lead you to not notice whether or not you are having a good time.
Yeah, and I think that's a really big issue for people who've been socialized as women. They're very focused often on pleasing other people. And that's, the way they've been socialized, but is also a survival mechanism for a lot of people. And so having to kind of like help people form new scripts in the body of like, it's okay to focus how you're feeling is important and is worthy of, being respected and worthy of being explored.
Yeah. Once again, to bring it back to trauma, particularly people who have developed fawn as a response, which do you want to talk a little bit about trauma responses? Folks may not be familiar with the terms. I think most people have heard fight or flight, but there's other ones.
Yeah, like the people-pleasing trauma response in response to like real or perceived threat, the body goes into this like, how can I shrink? How can I please? How can I minimize this threat that's happening? Fighting is, I think often people think of that as a trauma response and as the acceptable one of like pushing someone away, blah, blah, blah. Fleeing is like you're leaving the situation, escaping in some way. And then freezing is, various things, but you're maybe disassociating from your body, you're feeling numb, you're just really not present. And so, when people are recovering from trauma, different things can show those responses, even if it's something that's really small. And I think that can often happen in a movement class that's not being taught in a trauma-informed way. Like if an instructor comes and touches the student and makes an adjustment on them, that student might look like they're on the outside, they're fine. Like they don't say no, they don't run away, they don't punch the instructor or anything. But inside they might be, completely like melting down, or freezing, numbing out. And so I think that's what's so important in these movement classes for instructors to know is like, I think every instructor should incorporate some trauma-informed practices into their classes, because you don't know what someone's experience is. And, we can't account for like every trigger that someone might have, but trauma-informed spaces are really making an effort to, open the space for people to give feedback and to try to minimize triggers. So I know for me in my yoga classes, they're online, but I don't play music. I don't like candles. I don't use straps. And obviously I don't, offer physical assist because it's online, but even in my in-person workshops, I don't give physical assist and different stuff like that to kind of address those responses that people might have and to create that safer space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would encourage everyone listening to, also, certainly there are basic expectations that I would have of a pole instructor, right? Asking for consent before spotting, unless there is. If it is between stopping to ask for consent and stopping you from falling on your head, I think that the dial goes towards stopping you from falling on your head. Concussions are really no joke. But, for like minor stuff, definitely you don't want to be like touched without your consent in a pole setting in particular, especially because you're generally not wearing that much clothing. Yeah, and also just being mindful of language, right? Even if I think, not every pole instructor is gonna, go the whole 9 yards to remove, as many common triggers as possible. I think that there is a certain expectation that you are an adult and are being treated with respect. And also, if you are not an adult, you're still being treated with respect, right? It's still important that you are given autonomy. Even things like, this is just sort of like broader as well. Like, students can go to the bathroom in the middle of class without asking permission, right?
Yeah.
Like, just letting people notice their own body and react accordingly and giving them space to do that, I think is something that, as a pole student, you should be able to expect wherever you are training pole.
Yeah. And it's tough because I think there are still spaces that like instructors would get mad if you left the class to go to the bathroom, or if you stopped doing the pose because you didn't want to do it, but like everyone else was doing it. And like, I know I've had instructors get mad at me when I like say I don't want a physical assist. And I think it's difficult sometimes in certain areas to find instructors who are trauma informed, but I really encourage people to like look for that and also just feel empowered in themselves to, wherever you are, to do what you need to do to take care of yourself.
You don't have to suffer to exercise or do your fun activity that you like. You can find other options, and you should if you're not having a good time. This is my general advice to everyone about exercise, just in general, for everybody.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's tough because, our culture is really full, and I think even from that young age of like when I know a lot of people had that experience in gym class where they were kind of like almost forced to do things that they really didn't want to do. Mm-hmm. And I think that impacts people later on of like they feel like they have to push through stuff.
Absolutely. Like fitness instructors will say with a straight face, no pain, no gain. You should not be encouraging your clients to think that pain is normal.
I feel the same way because I think that, especially with pain, like that's such a big indicator of like maybe it's time that you should stop.
Yeah. And there's certainly some degree of necessary pain for specific movements in pole, but your instructor should be clear about like what type of pain or discomfort is expected and natural, and also like give you the option to take breaks and give you the option to say no and give you modifications that are not going to have that, feeling for you. I know somebody once reached out to me and was like, given my past and history, I cannot do pole sits for me. They are straight up triggering. I'm never going to be able to do that. So if that's a student that, you have, give them other options so they can still have a fun time and enjoy themselves and have something to do without forcing them to do something that is actively harmful to them.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's so beautiful just, for life, but also for sexuality. And to me speaks to the way that like pole or even like yoga classes can, impact our sexuality lives by like really helping us to know that, we can listen to our body and we are the experts of our body. Like we are the only ones that know what our bodies are feeling, and we have that power and that autonomy to make choices about what we want to do with our bodies. And also that we deserve to be with people and in spaces that really support those choices and, celebrate and honor them.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of people who celebrate and honor those choices, if folks wanted to work with you or follow you or find out more about you, where could they do that?
Yeah, so my website is kelseybritt.com, and then on Instagram, I'm at Keabri, which is Keabri. And I also have a Substack, which is where I write different essays about sexuality stuff, and also where my podcast is located, and where I'm going to be also publishing some different like poems and essays from other people around sexuality. And so that is called The Curious Clit.
That one may not be in the show notes, but certainly the link to your website and Instagram will be, and I'm sure you can find it from there.
Yep.
Before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to plug, or like a recommendation, or something you just like that people should know about?
I'm teaching a trauma-informed yoga class online at 10 a.m. Pacific on Sundays. And then in a few weeks, I'm launching my more like sexuality-based class, which will be on Tuesdays at 4 p.m. Pacific. And so you can find information about those on my website.
All right, fabulous. So if you're looking for some trauma-informed online yoga / sexuality education, check it out. And I'll put the links in the description. All right. Thank you so much for joining me today, Kelsey. This has been a great conversation. I think lots of food for thought. And, if these are things that you who are listening have not thought about previously, hey, don't feel bad about it. Don't beat yourself up for being like, oh, I could have said no and left this whole time. Gosh darn it. Just be nice to yourself and embrace a new way of thinking about yourself and your body, perhaps.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Rosie.
Thank you.
It's been great.
And I will talk to y'all later. Bye. Thanks so much for joining me today, Pole Dancer. This podcast is a production of Slink Through Strength, the inclusive, evidence-based online pole studio. So if you're looking for a place to train, either off-pole conditioning and flexibility, or learning pole tricks and refining your pole movement, you can find us online at slinkthroughstrength.com.